And hopefully, you guys have seen a little bit of what this early Christian community is doing with this thing called the gospel, this good news. That the early Christian community, man, they were doing some really, really cool, great, amazing stuff, right? And mainly the book of Acts is focused on the life of this guy, Paul, who most of us are very familiar with. We've seen Paul go through everything. We saw him get shipwrecked. We saw him get tortured by the police. We read about him getting the mob coming to beat him down within an inch of his life. We see Paul going through the ringer. He's traveling all around. He's planting churches. People are throwing things at him at times. Other times people are wanting to call him a god and wanting to worship him. And he has to say, no, don't do that, please. And now we're at the end. This is the end of Paul. This is the last time we're going to hear about Paul. The last time that Luke's going to write about Paul. You know, remember I told you that there's the Gospel of Luke, which Luke wrote, and then the book of Acts, which Luke wrote. So you had Luke, and then sort of chapter 2 is the book of Acts. There's no chapter 3. There's no more. This is the end. And there's something amazing that we learn from the way Paul approaches his ending. And I'm going to do something here today. I'm going to change my stripes. Is that the expression? I'm going to do something that I don't ever do. I know when you guys come here, I try to have the nice, orderly 3-point sermon, and I do the outline. I did an outline for you today, and it was painful. It was hard. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to be fully free form. I'm not going to give you an outline today. We're not going to do that. We're going to mix it up. We're going to change it a little bit. I'm going to tell you a story. Start with a story. It's sort of, consider this like the last day of school, you know? You know, Kelly and Aaron, the teachers know the last day of school. You remember that. When it's almost controlled chaos, and the kids, you kind of have to do a lesson plan, but you don't want to do it, and the kids are antsy, and so, the teachers have to just come up with something to do to kill the hours to get through that last day of school. So today's our last day of school in the book of Acts. So we'll break the mold a little bit. I'm not going to give you 3 points. I'm going to give you a couple observations. I'll give you 3 points. Let me start with a story. And it's the story of Paul, okay? Paul here, as we see him, is an old man. Depending upon who you read, he's probably, let's put him at about 80 years old, maybe 85. He's old. More than old, he's just beaten down. I mean, he's been literally physically beaten. You can imagine him. He still probably has scars on his body. He probably still has marks on his face. I imagine him that he's probably got really gray, wispy hair. He's probably lost a lot of his hair because of all the stress that he's gone through in his life. He's probably looks a little rough around the edges. He's got, he's not well cleaned, well kept. Because remember, now he's a prisoner. And he's in his home, a house prison in Rome. So he doesn't have a lot of money either. Remember, he makes tents. But about this time, Rome's not at war. So really, for tent makers, you only made a lot of money when the city-state went to war. So he's making his tents, but he's not making a lot of money. So imagine this guy, Paul, sitting in a home, his house, grayed hair, beaten skin, frail body, tired, weary, and he sits in his home for 2 years. He can't leave. Because at this time, your accusers, if you were accused of a crime, they had 2 years to bring up evidence against you and to go present it to Caesar. And Paul has said, I want my case, my trial, to go before Caesar. So because he said that, his accusers get 2 years to drum up all the evidence they want. Now 2 years goes by for old Paul, the senior citizen Paul. This is not the strong, boisterous preaching Paul that you're probably used to. This is the frail, old, weak Paul. 2 years goes by as he rots away in his home. Nobody ever brings any trial against him. Because remember, he's accused in Judea, and the people in Judea probably thought, first of all, they're false charges. So the people in Judea probably, if I was them, I would say, why? I'm not going to go to Rome. You know how far that is? Oh, it's hot this time of year. I can't use my miles. I can't use my points to travel. It's just going to be inconvenient. We got to get on a boat. The boat might get shipwrecked. No. Let him go. I don't care. And that's what they do. They let him go. So Paul sits in his home for 2 years, old Paul. And after 2 years, he's freed. And he stays in Rome because Paul wants to go to Spain, not on vacation, but on a missions trip. But the problem with going on a missions trip is you need money. And Paul doesn't have a whole lot of it. So he stays in Rome another 2 years, just making tents, making as many tents as he can, as he's a free man, but he can't leave. He's making tents and tents and tents. Remember, Rome's not at war, so there's not a whole lot of money in tent making. It takes him 2 years, and he's saving up as much money as he can to get over to Spain, because he feels that's where God's calling him, to go to Spain. Now he gets arrested again. Paul, the troublemaker. Actually, people falsely accuse him again. They say, this guy did something wrong. They arrest him again. And surely Paul at this point, he's old. He's probably, time it out, 86, 87, 88 years old. He's tired. He probably had to say, you guys, I give up. Okay, I'll go to trial. So he goes to trial. And he goes in front of Caesar, the emperor. But at this time, the emperor is Nero. And Nero doesn't really like this whole Christian thing. He's not a fan of Christianity. He hates it. Because Nero knows that as this Christianity thing is growing, and people's lives are changing, they're worshiping this other God, and they no longer worship the emperor as God. And so Nero looks at Paul, I'm sure, imagine him. Paul's brought before Nero, and Nero's got to look at him and say, look, I got it. I got the president of this Christian thing. I got the CEO. I got the main guy. This is the guy. If I get rid of him, then I get rid of this whole thing. Remember, Peter, who knows where Peter is? He's back in Jerusalem partying it up. Paul's in Rome in front of Nero the emperor. And Nero surely looks at him and says, I got you now. Imagine this as a Hollywood movie. And Nero says, now you're going to pay. So Nero takes Paul, carts him down the street in the public circle, and cuts off his head. And Nero surely thinks, now Christianity's done, Paul is done. And so the church people, the Christians in Rome, because there was a big church at the time, they all get together, and of course this is Paul. He's laying in the middle of the road, his head's chopped off, their leader has died. So what do? They pick him up, wrap him up, they bury him in the middle of Rome, and they wrap him with purple cloth. And purple at the time was a way to say, this is a king, this is somebody important. And they put incense in his tomb as a way to say, may he smell great forever, may he just always, never let the stink of death take him, let him just smell fragrant and beautiful. That's the story. What's interesting about that story is that we can prove none of it. We don't know it. What I just told you was a story based entirely on church tradition. We don't know how Paul ended. Luke, writing in the book of Acts, ends with what Brian just read. The last things that we know Paul was doing in Rome, for sure from the Bible, was that he was speaking the gospel and the kingdom of God with boldness and without hindrance. The end. I know some of you have favorite TV shows. Can you imagine if you're watching the series finale of your TV show, not the season, the series finale, this is the big one, right? And just as the main character reaches out to get, the love of his life or her life, whatever, the TV goes black. How frustrated would you have been? Surely, what's the ending? What happens? Luke's intentional to show us a blacked out screen. We don't know. Does Paul go before Caesar? Maybe, we think so. Was he beheaded? We think so. Was he buried in the middle of the Rome with the purple cloth around him? We think so. But Luke and Paul are intentional about the way Paul's life ends. the way the story ends, and they want you and me to see something about the way Paul's story ends versus the way you and I imagine our story to end. See, we all finish things, you and I. There will be an end to everything that you are doing. A lot of you are not residents of Seoul, so there's a time that you're going to leave this place. Your time here is going to end. It's going to finish. I know my time here is going to finish. I know when it's going to finish, in the fall of 2017. We live our life in constant endings. Relationships end. School ends. Jobs end. And when things end for us at the finish line, I will bet you that we react dramatically different than the way Paul does, the way that I'm going to observe that Paul reacts at the end. At the end of the story of Acts and at the end of his life in 2 Timothy. We don't know what happened at the end, and the reason why is because Luke wants us to see that the entire book of Acts, it wasn't about Paul. It wasn't about Peter. It wasn't even about the church. The entire book of Acts points to one thing and one thing alone, this thing called the gospel, this good news of grace. At end of Acts 28, that's the last thing we see Paul doing. In his home, preaching the gospel. You and I are going to finish things. We all end. Everything ends. Let me give you a personal example here. I've had a lot of jobs, and a lot of weird, different jobs. So much to the point that one of the people who used to come here regularly to church, who's since left, she asked me one time, she said, wait a second, hold on, Aric. You tell me that you've been a personal trainer, you've been a sous chef, you've worked for UPS delivering packages, you've worked in marketing, you worked as a waiter. What else did you, she looked at me and she said, is that all true, or were you just lying about all that? And of course, she was joking, but I said, why would a pastor ever lie about his stuff on the pulpit? It happens. Not then. I'm honest. I have a lot of weird jobs. Now listen, what I love the most, and I'm going to be very honest, what I love most is when those jobs have ended. Because you know what happens when they end? You get the going away party. You get the going away lunch. Oh, I loved it. I love those, don't you? When you end school, when you end your work, when you end, not in relationships necessarily, you don't get a going away lunch on relationships. So let's keep it to jobs and school, okay? When you end it, isn't that great? Because why? It's all about you. I felt so good. You know, I talked a couple weeks ago how I love getting pats on the back, and a couple of you gave them to me. Thank you for that. I loved it. Because the going away lunch at the end of your job is the ultimate pat on the back. It's when the time when everybody looks and says, oh, we're going to miss you. Oh, you're invaluable here. Oh, the things you've done. And you know that next week they're going to forget you. You know that. But for that shred of a moment, oh, how good that feels. Because when you and I finish things, we love the glory. We love the acclaim. Be honest. Come on. Let it out. I loved it in all of my jobs. I loved it because that was the moment that everybody looked at me. The spotlight was on me for that brief moment. But when Paul finishes, when Paul's coming to the end, he doesn't act the same way as I do. He doesn't get the glory. He doesn't seek the acclaim. He doesn't get the gold watch. He doesn't get the gifts. He doesn't get the presents. Remember, he's the old Paul, beaten, weary, broken, and he's home, and he's alone. It's not even his home. It's a rented home in Rome, far away from his birthplace. And yet Paul, at the finish line, when he finishes the race, he does something radically different. Do you ever watch, if you watch like, I don't know, if you're into horse racing, I'm going to give a horse racing. I was going to do a regular race. Let's do horse race. At the end of a horse race, right, the Kentucky Derby, whatever it is, the horse race, when they get done, and it's usually quick, the winner goes into the winner's circle, and they interview the winner. And you'll know something about the character of that winner. You'll know something about where that winner's heart really is by who they think. See, there's a lot of jockeys who ride the horse, who win the race, they get off the horse, and the first thing when the person puts the microphone in front of their face, they say, oh man, I did good today. I felt good, I was pumped. I was focused, I was out there, I was riding hard. But there's other jockeys, there's other racers who get off the horse and they say, wow, man, my team today did really well. The horse rode beautifully, didn't it? I can't take credit for this. It was all the horse, it was all the team. Paul, at the end of his race, here in 2 Timothy, says, I finished the race. And you're going to see something radically unique that he does, and he does it because of the gospel. First, I got to throw this one quote in there. I said I wasn't going to quote anything today, but I got to quote Tom Cruise. Can I quote him real quick? I know, it's sad, but 80s movie, Cocktail, you remember this? He's in a fight, he's in a relationship with this woman, and they get in a fight, and he wants to end it. He punches the one guy punches him. They're downstairs, and the woman yells at him. She says, I don't want this to end badly. I don't want it to end badly. And Tom Cruise, whether you like his acting or not, says everything ends badly, or it wouldn't end at all. He says everything ends badly, otherwise it wouldn't end at all. It's a very pessimistic way to look at endings. Paul's not that pessimistic. Paul's extremely optimistic because of the gospel. Paul shows us that everything ends, yes, but everything doesn't have to end badly. What does Paul do? Here's some observations. I said we're going to do story time with old Paul. I'm not going to give you 3 points, just some observations to throw out there. First, do you see in Acts 28, when Brian read it, what Paul is doing at the end of the story? The very last sentence. Paul spoke about the kingdom of God and the gospel with 2 words, or 3, boldness and without hindrance. Let me unpack that for you. I can't draw a picture here this morning, sorry Kelly, but I'll unpack it as best I can. He does it with boldness. He preaches the gospel with boldness. Now what this means is this. Imagine you're Paul's neighbor, okay? You live next door to Paul, he's invited you over for dinner. He says, come on over for dinner. Now, you're surely going to look at your husband or your wife and say, honey, do we have to go? Because you know all he's going to do, this Paul guy, is just talk about the gospel. The gospel, the gospel, the gospel. You'd surely look at your husband or your wife and say, honey, do we got to go? Because, you know, when he's washing the dishes, he's going to be talking about the gospel. When he puts the meat out, he's going to be talking about the gospel. When he pours us a drink, he's going to be talking about the gospel. Paul could not stop talking about the good news of what Jesus did for him. And that's what it means when it says with all boldness. It means that if you went to dinner at Paul's house, be prepared for a whole lot of gospel. That's all he's going to give you. He'll feed you. He'll give you some drinks. He'll take care of you, but you got to be prepared. If you're going to go into Paul's house, he's going to give you nothing but bold gospel talking. Not only that, but it says without hindrance. Now, this is an odd phrase, and don't skip over this too quickly. We can't. Without hindrance, meaning that Paul spoke freely. This was unheard of at the time. If you were under house arrest, which Paul was, first of all, you weren't allowed to get visitors. But Paul gets visitors. Secondly, you surely would not be allowed to speak a doctrine that worked against the emperor, which is what the gospel was. The gospel says, worship God in heaven, not Nero. No way, under no circumstance would that have been allowed. And yet Paul is allowed without hindrance to do it. Now, what does this mean? It means that the guards, imagine, this is old Paul sitting in his house. He's lonely. He wants you to come over for dinner. The guards will see you coming. First of all, you wouldn't have come normally, but the guards see you coming and they say, come on in. And they open the door and they say, come on in. This guy believes something I don't believe, the guards would say. This guy believes this thing called the gospel, this thing called grace. He worships this guy named Jesus. I don't do it. I worship Nero, but feel free to come on in and listen to him. Do you realize the absurdity of this? It's because the guards, and we've seen this all throughout the book of Acts, the guards see something special in Paul. They look at Paul, and the image of Paul, he always was described as a short, kind of fat guy. He's not good looking. He's not charismatic. He actually had a speech problem. Probably he wasn't a good speaker. There was nothing attractive in him. There was nothing that was going to attract the guards to him. Nothing that was going to make the guards look at him favorably, especially this old, weary Paul, gray-haired and broken down and lonely. They would never have looked at him and seen any favor in him. But when he starts talking about this gospel thing, the guards start to pay attention. And he's allowed to speak boldly, meaning all the time, and he's allowed to speak without hindrance, meaning, come on in, the guards would say. How awesome would that be? As a side note, think about this. If people that did not believe what you and I believe, if you believe in worshiping Jesus, if you believe in the gospel, if people who do not share those same beliefs still look at you and say there's something special about this person, there's something unique. See, a lot of times when you talk to non-believers, their number one problem with Christianity is that we're always trying to convert people. And they say, just keep your beliefs to yourself. Do whatever you want, keep them to yourself. I don't believe what you believe, keep it to yourself. Don't try to proselytize me, that big word. Don't try to convert me. Here are the guards who do not believe what Paul believes, who don't share his culture, his worldview, they don't share his religion. They say to his friends, come on in. This gospel thing, something's different about it. Not only that, he speaks with boldness, he speaks without hindrance. But we read from 2 Timothy, and the reason why I did that is because 2 Timothy, the book, is most likely the last book that Paul wrote. Almost everybody agrees. It's almost definitely the last book that he wrote. And this is why in chapter 4 he says his time for departure is done. This would have been in that fictional or quasi-fictional story that I told you. This is the old Paul, gray-haired Paul, after he's been freed. Now he's in prison again, and he's about to go for Nero, and he certainly knows the end is coming. His time here on earth is done. Now you and I finish things, like I said, we finish our jobs, we finish living here in Korea, we're going to finish relationships, we finish things all the time. Here Paul was facing the ultimate finish, death. He knew it. He knew he either was going to die of old age in a home alone, or most certainly he was going to go in front of the emperor and die by execution. And he says something radical here. Take this into consideration. You're Paul. Remember, gray hair Paul. And you're writing to little Timothy, your protege. And this is the last thing you're ever going to write him. This is the last thing you're going to write forever. What would you say? If I was Paul, you know what I would say? I'd say, hey, man, how about those hundreds and hundreds of churches that I planted? How are they doing? Hey, Timothy, how about those thousands of people that I converted? How are they doing? How about, Timothy, how about all these books that I've written that people are going to be studying 2,000 years from now? How about that? Paul writes none of that. He doesn't talk about the churches. This is Paul. He has single-handedly shaped one of the major world religions that is sweeping the nation at the time. And from his writing in 2 Timothy, at the end, at the finish line, you would never know it. Because he doesn't take credit for it. He says the exact opposite. He says, I'm poured out. He literally was saying, I'm a cup. I've been filled up. Now I'm being emptied for you. He doesn't take credit. He's poured out. And he says, I finished the race. I'm at the end. And there's a moment here where he starts to say, well, I'm going to get the crown of righteousness. And right there you can go, gray-haired Paul. Now you're starting to take credit. Now you're starting to get the glory. But read the end. He says, I'm going to get a crown. Just like everybody else who has this weird idiomatic phrase that doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible that I can find. It says, all who have loved his appearing. Now what this means, let me unpack this for you. What it means is Paul is basically saying this. I get a crown at my finish line, not because of what I've achieved, but because of what he's accomplished. Paul doesn't look to his achievements. He looks to Jesus' accomplishment. He says, I was self-righteous. I was a jerk. I was mean. Remember when we first met Paul? He was throwing people in prison. He was getting people executed. He was judging them. He was a moralist. He thought he was better than everybody else. And he says, the only thing that changed in my life was when Jesus appeared to me. All who have loved his appearing. This makes Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, at his finish line, look at death in the eyes. He looks at death and he says, "O death, where is thy sting? Where is your power?" Now, how cool would it be if you and I, at our finishes, when things come to an end, that we can be a Paul, that we can give away glory instead of getting glory. We can give away credit instead of getting credit. He could take credit for Paul could take credit for converting thousands and thousands of people, starting a major world religion, planting churches. He was a rock star. And at the end of his life, he simply says, I'm poured out. I finished the race. Why? Because it was because Jesus appeared to him. See, Paul knows the gospel. He knows that at the finish line, all of our finishes, jobs, whatever it may be, school, there's going to come a choice that you and I at the finish can choose to either take the credit for what we've done, to heap it on ourselves, or we can choose to give it away. Paul gives it away because he says, you know what? When Jesus appeared to me, I no longer need glory. I've seen his glory. I no longer need you to give me a pat on the back because Jesus does that for what he did on the cross to save me. When he says, for all who have loved his appearing, he's referring to the resurrection. And do you remember what happened to Paul in his conversion experience when we looked at it a few weeks ago? Jesus comes to him and literally the light knocks Paul down off his horse. Paul would basically say this, I was on a horse of self-righteousness, a horse of my own glory, a horse of my own credit. And the only thing that's going to knock me down is the presence of Jesus in my life. It's what he did. Jesus' accomplishment on the cross and through the resurrection for a broken and needy, self-righteous jerk like Paul was. That's what changed Paul. And now to end the story, we get Paul, gray-haired, frail, feeble, alone, facing his death. And instead of taking credit, instead of hoarding it, instead of asking for a pat on the back, he simply says, I'm poured out. Because he knows that he worships a God who poured himself out for him first. You and I, we're going to finish things. Can we finish it like Paul? Can we finish it at the end, giving away the glory, the credit, giving it away to the gospel and preaching the gospel in boldness and hindrance? Let me ask you this. If the last chapter of your life were to be written today, if your life was Acts 28, what would be the last sentence? Would it be that you preached the gospel in the kingdom of God with boldness and without hindrance, that you were poured out? Would that be the last sentence? For most of us in this room, the last sentence would probably be something like this. Didn't I do a good job? Didn't I deserve this? Look what I've accomplished. Look what I've achieved. That's usually the last line in our biography. That wasn't the last line in Paul's. The gospel made it so. He was changed by grace, humbled by it, forever, to say that he's going to pour himself out. He's finished the race, kept the faith. Don't give him credit. It's not about Paul, it's about the gospel, and that's what he wanted us to see all along. That's your last day of school. So you're dismissed now. Let's pray. Father, we come to you